My theme will be tonight what I have experienced in the Netherlands, where I think supply of assisted dying has actually stirred the demand. What I will do is I will first show a little bit about the 50 years of history, and secondly, I will show something about the rise in the numbers. A very important topic will be whether the euthanasia or assisted dying will lower the numbers of violent suicides. I will say something about how physicians experiences to the performing assisted dying, some other developments and some reflections. Now, I will start out with a website that I found in your country in the campaign Dignity in Dying, where it is said the inescapable truth, and where you can see that this is actually, you can see it's a warning, it contains a warning. It says this report contains detailed and graphic accounts of physical and emotional distress that people have experienced at the end of life. I think this is almost criminal in the sense that this is an attempt to scare the public. And if that is the mindset that is conveyed to the general public, I think something is terribly wrong. I wanted to share that with you now, because I think fear is always a bad advisor. Now, as for the history of the Dutch system, it started actually 50 years ago with a similar discussion as you have now. And it was written, a book, Medical Power and Medical Ethics, written by a famous physician, Vandenberg, who said that physicians are causing suffering instead of healing and relieving it. And he showed some terrible pictures that he had made in the Leiden Academic Hospital of people who had been treated until a phase that was really dehumanizing. And the logic of Vandenberg was that physicians should not only learn to stop treating, but they should also learn how to end the life of a patient. Almost the same as we have now in 2020 in England. Now, the history of the Dutch system is actually going back 50 years. And you see in 1972, the Dutch Voluntary Association was founded, and it now is the biggest organization of its kind in the world. It took us a long time, just as it takes a long time in Great Britain to discuss it. In 1994, there was a first makeshift law, and it ended up in 2002 in the form of a definitive law. The criteria for getting assistance in dying was that first you must have a medical diagnosis, which means that it is ruled out that you just simply suffering from old age or from other non-medical diseases, non-medical causes. Secondly, there must be a patient request, including that if there is no patient request, we do not call it assisted dying or euthanasia. We would call it a termination of life, not on request. So the patient request really was, as it is in your country, the cornerstone of the Dutch euthanasia program. Thirdly, there should be unbearable suffering, and fourthly, without prospect of improvement. Of course, these two criteria are vital. You see, I can have unbearable suffering, such as what I once experienced. I had a root canal treatment without anesthesia. That is truly unbearable suffering, but I knew that in an hour from now I would be out on the street again. So that was unbearable, but not without prospect of improvement. And similarly, there can be conditions where your situation will never get better, such as in a mild chronic condition. They will never get better, but it is unbearable. So you have to have those two, unbearable and no prospect of improvement. And then fifthly, the terminal illness was not officially written in the law, but actually it was in the background as a shadow criterion. We, as a review committee, would be very, very upset if there was a patient who had years to live. and we would invite the doctor and ask them how to explain their actions. And then, very important, and I'm proud of that, there was an opt-out both for individual doctors and for institutions, unlike, for example, in Canada nowadays, where providing assisted dying actually is considered a duty on the part of an institution. I'm also proud to say that the Netherlands has, I think, the best, worldwide best overview systems. First, we have scan doctors, which means support and consultation euthanasia Netherlands. So every case of euthanasia is being overviewed beforehand. Secondly, then there are review committees, of which I was part, who review each and every case of assisted dying after the fact. And thirdly, we have every 5 years, we have a legal evaluation how things are going. So I think, given that those criteria, I was proud to be part of that system. But I have actually seen, to my dismay, that it didn't prevent us from going and sliding down. As you can see on the next slide, you can see here the numbers and the pathologies. And I here compare the numbers of 2002 and 2019. You can see in 2002, we had almost 1,900 reports, most of which were cancer. You can see in 2019, we had 3,000 and almost 6,400 cases of assisted dying. And you can see that there still is, the bulk is still cancer, but there have come to it very important categories such as dementia, psychiatry, and other things. Neurology has become more and more important. But also we have seen reports of people with chronic diseases, handicaps, etc., people with blindness. So I was actually more and more concerned that this is not helping people to prevent a terrible death, but it rather developed into preventing a terrible life, you see. The difference between preventing a terrible death, as it is discussed now in your country, for the coming 5 or 10 years, it will be preventing a terrible death. But sooner or later, I am absolutely convinced that other people will say, why can we help people die who are in terminal illness, and why not in, for example, psychiatric illnesses? A very important argument in the whole discussion is that assisted dying will prevent people committing suicide. Actually, I think that that is simply not true. You probably know the discussions. If you're opposed to assisted dying, someone will ask you, do you want people to throw themselves in front of a train or down a high-rise building? And of course you don't want that. But as I can understand that people think that assisted dying will prevent terrible suicides, and I think it does. It does in individual cases. And it may in individual cases even keep people from killing themselves altogether, because the prospect of having a smooth death may give them reassurance and alleviate their suffering. However, generally speaking, what you can see in the Netherlands is that the numbers of suicide have gone up. They have in the past 10 years gone up by 100. The euthanasia numbers have gone up by 150%. And during the same years, the suicide rates went up by 35%. And the interesting thing is that in the neighboring countries, suicides went down. For example, in neighboring Germany, which has about the same population in terms of age, religion, and economy, during the same years where in Germany euthanasia is not possible, the suicide numbers went down by 10%. So in the years when euthanasia became available for exactly the category of patients that are prone to commit suicide, it just went up and up. And the director of the Center Bureau of Statistics, Jan Latten, said that, well, so much public discussion about ending your own life, so people will tend to act accordingly. You could say that ending your life becomes a trending topic. And I say this with all respect for the individuals who feel that there is no other way out. Let me be sure about that. I've seen those dossiers, those files, those reports, and I had tears in my eyes. But on the whole, I think the signal that is being sent to a society is that death is the solution to any form of unbearable suffering. And I think that that's a discomforting development. So my conclusion is that the claim that assisted dying will prevent violent suicide finds no empirical evidence. And please help me if I am wrong, but I say this to the best of my knowledge. Interesting also for your purposes may be that the physicians have become more and more hesitant in the Netherlands. The number of physicians who have said they will never kill a patient went up from 11% in 2002 to 19% in 2015. So grossly speaking, first it was 1 out of 10 who said I will never provide assisted dying. Now it is 1 out of 5 who says that. And why is that? Well, 2/3 of all Dutch physicians, according to a survey by the Dutch Physicians Organization, they say that they experience pressure and undue pressure and pressure growing. And they also say that the public underestimates the emotional stress that assisted dying puts on doctors. So I think that is a very important signal. You have to realize that this is in a context of a more and more secular population of physicians, and they still think that this is not the right thing to do. And I think a very important thing is that if you would have campaigned in favor of assisted dying in the 1980s, you may have been right, as we were in the Netherlands in the 1980s and 1990s. However, I think actually that in the Netherlands, we probably wouldn't have had a euthanasia law if we had had in the 1980s the level of palliative care that we have now. Euthanasia, ladies and gentlemen, is not about pain. It's not about apnea. It's not about nausea. It is about care dependence and meaninglessness, and in a number of cases also loneliness. In the files that I have seen where the life expectancy of the patient was longer than 6 months, in 40% of those cases, I saw that loneliness was one of the main, one of the main reasons. Just to round that up, because I don't have much time, some other developments. We have seen the extension from terminally ill to all illnesses, including dementia, psychiatry. Importantly also is that we have now seen that active killing is becoming a default way to die. There's we have done a survey based on sound knowledge, and it says that now in some districts in the Netherlands, euthanasia and assisted suicide account for 12% of all deaths. And this may be up to 25% if we only count the patients with a terminal illness. And then some examples of other developments. First, we have now in the Netherlands a law proposal which says that assisted dying should be possible for any person over 75 who is not ill. Secondly, and very importantly, in Canada, you know that in Canada they had the criterion that you should have a terminal illness. However, in 2019, on the 11th of September, the Supreme Court of the Superior Court of Quebec ruled that it is unconstitutional to limit assisted dying to only people with a limited life expectancy. So I expect actually that right to die societies, as soon as you have legalized some form of assisted dying, will take the next step, and they will say that it is discrimination of other groups of patients, because frankly speaking, I think a psychiatric patient with much misery maybe suffering even much more than a terminal cancer patient who has access to the best palliative care and who will be dying within weeks. So my main reflections then is that my concerns, that if someone says that my concerns are scaremongering, that is just not true. You may just as well not believe in climate change. I am convinced that that assisted dying changes the way we deal with death and tragedy in a way similar as flying has changed the way we see the world. You see, if we can now fly to wherever in the world, it changes the way on the way we see the world. Supply, ladies and gentlemen, will create demand. If you like that, that's your right to be of that opinion, but don't be naive. Don't say that you can contain this, but because sooner or later it will expand. So it's no question if legalizing assisted dying will lead to further developments. It's only the question when. Thank you, and sorry for hasting so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Boer. That was really a stimulating and interesting presentation. And I was particularly taken and indeed concerned with the number of clear examples that you gave of the extension of limited circumstances in which initially assisted suicide is permitted in countries, and then as the law is changed, there's increasing pressure for these circumstances to be extended. Deeply concerning from a start where initially the law was meant to treat unbearable suffering, but that can no longer be the case in so many of the instances that you've spoken of. Can you tell us a little bit more about the impact on the doctors in the Netherlands? That's a question of great concern, how that is changing perhaps the medical profession, the training of doctors, and the erosion of what we might call the conscience in regard to assisted suicide.
Well, I think fortunately, and I have a daughter who is in med school, and I know many students. I think fortunately, amongst physicians, there is still a sound awareness that a physician should heal and not kill. And as I indicated, that there's the number of physicians who refuse to do euthanasia or assisted dying is on the rise. You know, there's a group I call those scan doctors, those consulting doctors. When they have intervision, these groups are sometimes called crying sessions because the pressure and the emotional impact is so big. So I don't have any reason to think that doctors in the Netherlands have less respect for life. I do know that there are several doctors who have, in my opinion, too little hesitancies towards assisted dying. But generally speaking, I think euthanasia still is not a normal medical action, and I am glad for that. And part of the reason, and I will stop then, part of the reason is that euthanasia is still part of the criminal law.
Thank you so much for that answer. We have another question now. Can you say more about the cases of involuntary or non-voluntary euthanasia in the Netherlands, their prevalence and examples?
Yes, thank you for that question. Very important question. Fortunately, there are relatively few examples of non-voluntary. So there's a difference between involuntary and non-voluntary. Non-voluntary means that there's no request. Involuntary in our country means that the patient says, no, don't. And then the doctor said, oh yes, you have to die. You know, well, that has now happened once. There was a dementia patient who had an advance directive, and she was killed on the basis of an advance directive, and the doctor actually killed her while she was resisting. and the Supreme Court, I think that is very discomforting. Supreme Court said in April this year that that was okay because the advance directive trumps the present will of the dementia patient. I think that is the most crying example of where things can go wrong. But generally speaking, I think euthanasia is still very voluntary in the Netherlands, but it has to be said that there is an enormous pressure on the side of both relatives and the general public in the direction that active killing is basically the most dignified way to die. And I think that is a very scaring way of pressure. People asking for it themselves. But they are basically, as I said about this website in the UK, that is basically misleading the people.
Thank you very much. I have a final question which actually links very closely to the final comments that you made. And it's, how far do you think there is a culture change on the part of the elderly or frail to almost consider themselves that they ought to be looking at this? You talked about often the reasons being a sense of meaningless or loneliness. And what can we do in this country to ensure that we protect against that culture change?
Well, old age may be very troublesome, really. So I think what we can do, of course, is we can try to solve the loneliness, but still, I think in a way we should be aware that there will be old age situations that are really terrible and that we cannot solve. Frankly speaking, that is the case. That having said, I think that providing killing is not a solution, but it deteriorates the problem. If the law proposal of one of the present coalition parties to provide assisted dying to all people over 75 if they wish so, if that becomes true, that is a powerful signal on the part of the government that if you're 75 years and older and you want to die, you actually may be right. And I think that the impact of such a law cannot be underestimated. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that stark warning to the UK and for your contribution this evening. We really appreciate you being with us. Thank you, Professor Boer.